Well, today we are looking at question number 74 in our shorter catechism, the second of three shorter catechism questions regarding the eighth commandment. And that question asked today, what is required in the eighth commandment? The answer, the eighth commandment requireth the lawful procuring and furthering the wealth and outward estate of ourselves and others. Now, if you look at the parallel question of this in the larger catechism, it expands on it as follows. It says the duties required in the eighth commandment are truth, faithfulness, injustice in contracts and commerce between man and man, rendering to everyone his due, restitution of goods unlawfully detained from the right owners thereof, giving and lending freely according to our abilities and the necessities of others, moderation of our judgments, wills, and affections concerning worldly goods, a provident care and study to keep, use, and dispose these things which are necessary, convenient for the sustentation of our nature and suitable to our condition, a lawful calling and diligence in it, frugality, avoiding unnecessary lawsuits and suretyship and other like engagements, and an endeavor by all just and lawful means to preserve, procure, and further the wealth and outward estate of others as well as our own. Well, that's a mouthful. And obviously, because of the nature of our shorter catechism lessons on Sunday, we can't dive into all of this. But what I want to do instead today is I want to highlight something that I think is fundamental and essential to understanding rightly this commandment. You know, when Enro introduced the eighth commandment to us last week, as I was listening to him and I was reading today's question and next week's question, something immediately jumped off the page to me. There are two words one's in today's question and the other in next week's question, that immediately got my attention because we've seen these two words before, specifically regarding the sixth commandment. And those two words are lawful and unjustly. If you look at how the divines answered in the shorter catechism version what the sixth commandment requires and prohibits, and you compare that to how they answer what the eighth commandment requires and prohibits, it's essentially identical. It's the same template. The difference, of course, the sixth commandment deals with life, whereas the eighth commandment deals with property, both of which we, especially in this country, treat as rights. And so that got the wheels turning in my head last week. If we recall what we said about the sixth commandment and life, we noted that biblically speaking, there is no such thing as an absolute intrinsic right to life. And so the questions of how we are to preserve life and what is and what is not acceptable in terms of taking life are all defined and determined by God, who grants us life. There are lawful endeavors to preserve life and not lawful endeavors. There are unjust reasons for taking life, but not all taking of life is unjust. That same exact template is used here by the Westminster Divines when it comes to property rights. You can procure and further the wealth of yourself and others, but you can only do so lawfully. And you are forbidden to hinder your wealth and estate and that of others if that hindering is unjust. Again, what are these two words, lawful and unjust, reminding us of? They are telling us this, and this was actually Enro's main point last week, if you were listening very carefully, that the same presupposition that undergirds the sixth commandment and the issues of life is the same presupposition that undergirds the eighth commandment and issues of property rights. And that presupposition is this, that it is God and not you, not the church, and not the state. It is God that is sovereign, and that His word, His law, takes priority over everything, including your needs and your wants. In fact, I would argue that a person cannot even begin to rightly understand the concept of theft and property rights when you take God and His law out of the picture. How could you? Because what determines what is theft or not? Is it just some arbitrary thing? Is it whatever the majority of people vote? Is it whatever the ruling party in D.C. decides it is? Was the eighth commandment some sort of vague, self-evident, intrinsic right that all people have? And Moses discovered and said, hey, this sounds kind of like a good idea. Let's adopt it. And God's like, give him the thumbs up. Or is the eighth commandment yet another expression of God's absolute sovereignty over your life? Well, I'm here to tell you it's the latter. The psalmist, Asaph, writes in Psalm 50, "For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine." Friends, the presupposition undergirding the eighth commandment is not some humanistic, absolute intrinsic right to property that Moses just adopted because it sounded like a good idea. Rather, it is that God is sovereign. It's that God owns all property on earth, and therefore any ownership of property that any of us have must be viewed as a stewardship from God. You are a housekeeper, friend. You're a servant. You don't own the house. And as a housekeeper, as a servant, to whom God allocates to each according to their abilities, one day that owner and that master of the house is going to return. And he's going to call you account for how you managed his property. Jesus tells us that very thing in Matthew 25. Joe Morecraft writes, quote, "God gives man property to manage according to his will and for his glory. Each human property owner is directly responsible to God for the lawful use of God's property delegated to him." End quote. And so any authority and any property rights that you and I have are not absolute and intrinsic, but are limited, delegated, and covenantal in nature. And you simply will not have a right understanding of theft and property rights divorced from that presupposition. So I wanted to emphasize that point today because, man, we've gotten so far away from this in our country with all the political speech and debate. So much so that national elections, if you think about it, they're basically us voting on which party do we think is going to handle better what they steal from us. Who's going to be the more tolerable thief to live with? That's what we're voting on. But then you get some third-party folks that like to jump in, the libertarians, and they say things like, well, any and all taxation is theft. In fact, someone just posted a meme of that, I think just last night, one of my friends. Is that true? Is any and all taxation theft? Think about that question for a second. That's a good little question to ask, to gauge where your mind is thinking regarding this commandment. I would argue no, it's not, according to Scripture. For example, was God instituting theft by demanding the tithe? Friends, the tithe is just a tax. So either God is demanding us to steal from one another, or the libertarian doesn't truly understand what constitutes theft because he has removed God and his law from the picture and has declared himself sovereign. In fact, the thief in Scripture is actually said of those who do not pay the tithe tax. That doesn't mean all taxes are therefore okay. You have to gauge it. It depends on the tax. It depends on what purpose that it's used for. But what do you think a party of fallen, sinful, libertarian creatures who have declared themselves sovereign and have ignored God and his law, what do you think that's going to lead to? Just more oppression, more tyranny. Any system that ignores God, this is the main point I want to get across today. Any system that ignores God, ignores his sovereign rule, and ignores his law is incomplete and dangerous. We have got to stop treating these so-called rights as if they're some self-evident laws that are just floating around in the ether that we just, hey, that's a good idea, we adopt it, and then somehow try to make it Christian. We cannot even rightly understand theft and property rights apart from the sovereignty of God and the priority of His Word. That's the context. That's the foundation. That's the presupposition that these concepts are given to us in. And divorcing that from the picture will only serve in the end to actually encourage theft, greed, and discontentment. So that was my main point. Something, again, I hope you can take that. Just be thinking about that presupposition as you continue to think upon what it is that God requires of us and how we act with our properties with regard to ourselves and to others.